December 5, 1945, at exactly 2:10 p.m. on December 5, 1945, 5 U.S. Navy TBM Avenger torpedo aircraft thundered down the runway at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. Their powerful Wright Cyclone engines sliced through the warm Florida afternoon air. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a decorated combat pilot with more than 2,500 flight hours, led the formation of 14 men on what should have been the most routine training mission imaginable. A simple navigation drill over the Bahamas, expected to last no longer than 2 hours. The weather was ideal. Visibility stretched for miles in every direction. The planes were virtually brand new, fresh from the assembly lines that had helped secure victory in World War II just 3 months earlier. These weren't inexperienced recruits either. Most were seasoned Navy aviators, familiar with these formidable torpedo bombers that had proven themselves repeatedly in the Pacific theater. By 7:04 p.m. that same evening, all 14 men had disappeared without a trace. The massive PBM Mariner rescue seaplane dispatched to locate them, carrying 13 additional crew members, exploded and vanished within minutes of takeoff. In one December afternoon, the U.S. Navy lost 27 men and 6 aircraft over calm waters, just off the Florida coast. What makes this story truly unsettling is that despite launching the most comprehensive air and sea search in naval history at that time, nothing was found. No floating wreckage, no oil slicks, no life rafts, no debris, no bodies. Not a single physical remnant of the 6 aircraft or the men who flew them. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the radio transmissions captured during those final hours reveal experienced pilots growing increasingly bewildered and disoriented, unable to determine their position despite flying in perfect visibility over well-known waters. Lieutenant Taylor's final communications hinted at something inexplicable, that his compasses had malfunctioned, that he couldn't recognize the ocean or islands below, and that his flight appeared to be somewhere they couldn't possibly be. This is the story of Flight 19, the disappearance that made the Bermuda Triangle infamous, a mystery that, even 79 years later, still defies rational explanation. To understand what occurred on December 5, 1945, we must first understand who these men were and what their mission entailed. Flight 19 was not a combat sortie or risky experimental flight. It was training exercise number 74, a routine navigation drill that had been conducted dozens of times without issue. The mission plan was simple and well-practiced. The 5 Avengers would take off from Fort Lauderdale, fly 56 miles east to Hens and Chicken Shoals to perform practice bombing runs on a derelict hulk, then fly 67 miles north, and finally turn southwest back to base, a total distance of roughly 140 miles and a flight time of around 2 hours. The route remained mostly within sight of land and over shallow, well-charted waters. The TBM Avenger was among the Navy's most dependable aircraft. These torpedo bombers had earned their reputation in the Pacific Campaign, flying thousands of missions from aircraft carriers. They were rugged, reliable, and equipped with multiple compasses, radio gear, and enough fuel for over 1,000 miles of flight. Leading the group was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a 28-year-old Texan from Corpus Christi. Taylor was no rookie pilot. He had flown numerous combat missions in the Pacific, amassed 2,500 flight hours, and survived being shot down twice, once ditching in the Pacific, and another time crash landing on a carrier deck. He was a man who knew how to handle crises and had proven his skill in bringing damaged aircraft home under dire conditions. His 4 wingmen were capable aviators as well, though several were student pilots completing advanced training. Marine Captain Edward Joseph Powers, piloting Avenger No. 2, was himself an experienced flyer. The remaining aircraft were piloted by student officers with considerable flight experience, nearing completion of their program. Each Avenger carried a 3-man crew: pilot, turret gunner, and radio operator. Together, these 14 men represented the heart of American military aviation in 1945. Some were young men eager for peacetime careers, while others were battle-hardened veterans like Taylor, nearing the end of their wartime service, all of them expected to return home for dinner that evening. The weather forecast for December 5th could not have been better. Clear skies, excellent visibility, and gentle winds. The kind of day that makes flying a pleasure instead of a duty. Several other training flights were scheduled that afternoon, and none of the instructors expressed any concern about the conditions. At 2:10 p.m., the 5 Avengers lifted off in flawless formation. Ground crew watched as they climbed into the radiant blue sky and turned east toward the Atlantic Ocean. Radio operators logged their departure and settled in for what should have been a routine day. In 2 hours, the planes were expected to return. The student pilots would debrief, and everyone would head to the mess hall for dinner. But Flight 19 never came back. What occurred during the next 5 hours would go on to fuel one of the most enduring enigmas in aviation history. For the first 90 minutes, everything proceeded as planned. Flight 19 reached Hens and Chicken Shoals right on schedule, completed their bombing runs, and began the second leg of their mission. Radio checks confirmed all aircraft were functioning properly and maintaining formation. Then, around 3:45 p.m., Fort Lauderdale radio operators began intercepting unusual communications among the aircraft. The pilots sounded uncertain of their position. By 4:45 p.m., Robert Cox, a flight instructor airborne nearby, overheard Taylor on the training frequency. Taylor reported both compasses had failed and that he couldn't identify landmarks below. Cox, alarmed, contacted Taylor for clarification. Taylor's reply was unnerving. "I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost after that last turn." Cox, an experienced instructor, tried to guide him, asking what landmarks he could see, what direction he was heading. Taylor's answers only deepened the mystery. "I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." The statement was perplexing. The Keys lay southwest of Fort Lauderdale, and any pilot could simply fly northeast to reach land. Moreover, if Taylor truly was over the Keys, the Coral Islands and Turquoise Shallows were unmistakable. Cox advised Taylor to fly north toward Miami, which should have been visible on such a clear afternoon. Yet, Taylor continued to insist he didn't recognize anything below, that his compasses were spinning erratically, the ocean looked wrong, and that the landmarks weren't where they should be. Most chillingly, he claimed they might be over the Gulf of Mexico, even though that was impossible. I've got some absolutely incredible stories coming up that I think you're going to find fascinating. By 5 p.m., the situation had deteriorated dramatically. Ground controllers at Fort Lauderdale were now fully aware they had a serious problem: flying. Deeper into the Atlantic, 5 aircraft with 14 men aboard were lost somewhere off the Florida coast, and their lead pilot seemed completely unable to determine his location, despite perfect visibility and calm conditions. The radio transmissions from Flight 19, which were being recorded and monitored by multiple stations, revealed Taylor consulting with his fellow pilots about their situation. Captain Powers, flying the No. 2 aircraft, apparently believed they were over the Atlantic east of Florida and suggested they fly west to reach the mainland. This would have been the correct assessment and the right action to take, but Taylor overruled him based on his conviction that they were over the Gulf of Mexico, west of Florida. Taylor ordered the formation to fly east, reasoning that this would bring them to the Florida Peninsula. If Taylor's assessment was correct, flying east would save them. But if Powers was right, and they were actually east of Florida, flying east would take them deeper into the Atlantic Ocean, away from land and safety. This decision, made by an experienced pilot who had demonstrated sound judgment under pressure many times before, would prove fatal because Captain Powers was right. They were east of Florida, over the Atlantic, and Taylor's order to fly east was taking them further from land with every passing minute. But here's what makes this decision so baffling. Taylor wasn't just some confused rookie. He was a decorated combat veteran with 2,500 flight hours. He'd navigated over the Pacific Ocean where landmarks were scarce and navigation required precise dead reckoning. He'd flown in combat conditions where lives depended on his judgment. Yet, on this perfect December afternoon over familiar waters near the Florida coast, he seemed completely unable to determine his location. What could cause such complete disorientation in an experienced pilot? The radio transmissions provide disturbing clues. Taylor repeatedly mentioned that his compasses were malfunctioning, both the magnetic compass and the gyro compass. But having one compass fail was unusual. Having both fail simultaneously was extraordinarily unlikely. Having all the compasses in all 5 aircraft fail at the same time was essentially impossible. Yet, that's what the evidence suggests happened. Multiple pilots in Flight 19 reported compass problems. Some mentioned their compasses were going crazy or spinning aimlessly. Others said their instruments were giving conflicting readings. It was as if some force was interfering with every magnetic and gyroscopic instrument in the formation simultaneously. By 5:15 p.m., radio transmissions from Flight 19 were becoming increasingly radio transmissions faded difficult to receive. But the signal strength was fading, suggesting the aircraft were moving further away from Florida rather than closer. Ground controllers were now desperately trying to establish the formation's location. But Taylor's descriptions of what he was seeing made no sense. He described flying over a chain of islands, which he believed were the Florida Keys. But the islands he was describing didn't match the Keys' distinctive geography. He mentioned seeing white beaches, which was consistent with many Bahamas islands, but not with his belief that he was west of Florida. Every landmark he reported contradicted his stated position. At 5:50 p.m., Taylor made a transmission that sent chills through everyone listening. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. This wasn't just a navigational problem anymore. This was a fuel crisis. The Avengers had been airborne for over 3½ hours. They were approaching their fuel limits, and Taylor knew they couldn't remain aloft much longer. More disturbing still was Taylor's insistence that they stay together. He was ordering all 5 aircraft to ditch in the ocean simultaneously when the first plane ran out of fuel, rather than allowing individual aircraft to attempt landing if they found land. This suggests Taylor believed they were so lost that coordinated ditching was their only hope for rescue. Ground controllers at Fort Lauderdale were now coordinating a massive rescue effort. Coast Guard stations were alerted. Naval vessels in the area were directed to listen for distress signals. Rescue aircraft were being prepared for launch. But all of these efforts required knowing where Flight 19 was located. And that information remained frustratingly elusive. At 6:04 p.m., nearly 4 hours into the flight, Taylor made another transmission that revealed just how lost they were. We're not sure where we are. We think we must be about 225 mir northeast of base. It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost. This position report, if accurate, would put them far out in the Atlantic, well beyond the point of no return for their fuel supply. Then at 6:20 p.m., a transmission came through that would haunt investigators for decades. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. The calmness in Taylor's voice was eerie. He wasn't panicking. He was methodically preparing his men for what he believed was inevitable. The last clearly heard transmission from Flight 19 came at approximately 7:04 p.m. After nearly 5 hours of flight, their fuel was exhausted. The message was brief and resigned. FTF-2'ing the call sign for Fort Lauderdale Tower. Then silence. 5 TBM Avengers carrying 14 men had vanished. But the tragedy of that December evening was far from over. At 7:27 p.m., a massive PBM-5 The Rescue Plane Explodes Mariner flying boat took off from Naval Air Station Banana River to search for the missing planes. The Mariner was essentially a flying rescue station equipped with supplies, medical equipment, and the ability to land on water to pick up survivors. Its crew of 13 men included experienced rescue specialists who had saved countless downed airmen. The Mariner's flight plan would take it directly to the area where Flight 19 was believed to have gone down. Its powerful radio equipment should have been able to detect any emergency beacons or distress signals from survivors. Its crew was trained to spot debris, life rafts, or men in the water, even in darkness. At 7:50 p.m., just 23 minutes after takeoff, the ship SS Gaines Mills reported seeing a tremendous explosion in the sky along the Mariner's flight path. The explosion was followed by a bright flash that illuminated the ocean's surface, then flames on the water that burned for several minutes before dying out. Radio operators tried desperately to contact the Mariner. There was no response. The flying boat and its crew of 13 men had simply ceased to exist. In the span of 5 hours, the United States Navy had lost 6 aircraft and 27 men under impossible circumstances. The loss of the rescue plane added a new dimension to the mystery. PBM Mariners had a well-known nickname among pilots, the Flying Gas Tank. They were notorious for fuel vapor accumulation that could be ignited by the smallest spark. The official Navy explanation for the Mariner's loss was that it had suffered a catastrophic fuel explosion shortly after takeoff. This explanation was plausible and consistent with the Mariner's known vulnerabilities. The SS Gaines Mills report of seeing an explosion and flames on the water supported this theory. Unlike Flight 19's disappearance, the Mariner's loss could be explained by understood mechanical failure. But the timing seemed almost cruelly ironic. The one aircraft sent to rescue the missing flight also disappeared within minutes of beginning its mission. And despite the reported explosion and flames on the water, subsequent searches found no floating debris from the Mariner either. The ocean had apparently swallowed all evidence of its destruction just as completely as it had erased Flight 19. As news of the disappearances spread through the night of December 5th, the Navy mobilized the largest the largest search operation begins rescue operation in its history up to that point. At first light on December 6th, over 300 aircraft launched from bases throughout Florida and the Caribbean. The Coast Guard deployed every available vessel. Navy ships converged on the search area from Port Sup and down the Atlantic coast. The search area was enormous, covering over 250,000 square miles of ocean. But searchers were optimistic. The Avengers were large aircraft. If they ditched on the surface, they would float for a considerable time before sinking. Each aircraft carried life rafts, emergency supplies, and radio beacons. Even if the planes had sunk, debris would be floating on the surface. Oil slicks would mark the impact points. Surely 14 men couldn't simply vanish without leaving some trace. For 5 days, the search continued around the clock. Aircraft flew grid patterns across vast expanses of ocean. Ships steamed back and forth, scanning the water for any sign of wreckage or survivors. The weather remained clear and calm. Perfect conditions for spotting debris or men in the water. They found nothing, not a single piece of wreckage, not one life raft, not even an oil slick or floating debris field. The ocean appeared completely undisturbed, as if 6 large military aircraft had never existed at all. On December 10th, the Navy officially called off the search for survivors and declared all 27 men lost and presumed dead. The search for wreckage would continue sporadically for weeks, but the conclusion was becoming inescapable. Flight 19 and the rescue Mariner had vanished without leaving any physical trace whatsoever. The disappearance sent shockwaves through the Navy and the nation. How could 5 aircraft vanish in perfect weather over well-raveled waters near the Florida coast? How could an experienced pilot like Taylor become so completely lost? And most disturbing of all, where were the aircraft? Where was the debris? Where were the bodies? The Navy immediately convened a board of inquiry to investigate the loss. The investigation would be extensive, examining every aspect of the mission, from the aircraft's mechanical condition to the pilot's training records to weather conditions, to radio transcripts. The board was determined to find answers. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. The Navy Investigation Official Investigation, which lasted several months and examined hundreds of pages of documentation, reached conclusions that satisfied almost nobody. The final report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic hedging, simultaneously acknowledging the inexplicable nature of the disappearance while trying to assign some logical cause. The investigators began with the most obvious question. Was there any mechanical failure that could explain what happened? They examined maintenance records for all 5 Avengers. Every aircraft had been properly serviced and inspected. There were no outstanding mechanical issues, no deferred maintenance, no history of problems. The planes were in excellent condition when they took off. Could the compasses have malfunctioned? The board examined this possibility extensively. Each Avenger carried multiple navigation instruments, a magnetic compass, a gyro compass, and radio direction-finding equipment. For Taylor to be as lost as he appeared, all of these instruments would have had to fail simultaneously. The board calculated the probability of this occurring and found it astronomically unlikely. Moreover, if compass failure was the problem, why couldn't Taylor simply navigate using visual landmarks? The flight was conducted in perfect visibility. From any position east of Florida, the mainland would be visible. The distinctive shape of the Florida Peninsula, the turquoise waters of the Bahamas, the coral islands of the Keys, all of these should have been unmistakable reference points. The board reviewed Taylor's training records and service history. They found an exemplary record. Taylor had flown combat missions in the Pacific. He'd survived being shot down twice. He'd accumulated over 2,500 flight hours. His performance evaluations consistently rated him as an excellent pilot with sound judgment and strong navigational skills. Yet, the radio transcripts revealed a pilot who seemed completely unable to determine his position despite perfect conditions. Taylor's insistence that he was over the Gulf of Mexico when he was actually over the Atlantic defied explanation. His description of landmarks that didn't match any known geography was equally baffling. The board considered whether Taylor might have been impaired somehow. Had he been drinking? Was he ill? Interviews with ground crew and fellow pilots who'd seen him before the flight revealed nothing unusual. Taylor had seemed perfectly normal during pre-flight preparations. There was no evidence of any physical or mental impairment. One curious detail emerged during the investigation. Taylor had actually requested to be excused from the mission earlier that day. He'd asked another instructor to take the flight because he had something else he needed to attend to. The request was denied due to scheduling issues, and Taylor had accepted the assignment without complaint. But some investigators wondered whether this reluctance suggested Taylor wasn't mentally prepared for the flight. The board also examined whether weather could have played any role. They reviewed meteorological data for December 5th exhaustively. Weather conditions were essentially perfect. Clear skies, good visibility, light winds. There were no storms, no unusual atmospheric conditions, nothing that would impair navigation or radio communication. Could the aircraft have flown into some kind of unusual atmospheric phenomenon that interfered with instruments? The board consulted with meteorologists and physicists. While certain atmospheric conditions could potentially interfere with magnetic compasses, these conditions would be localized and temporary. They couldn't explain sustained widespread compass failure affecting multiple aircraft for hours. The radio transcripts received extensive analysis. Communications experts attempted to determine Flight 19's position based on radio direction finding and signal strength analysis. The results were frustrating. The signals suggested the aircraft were moving generally northeast, away from Florida, and out into the Atlantic. But precise position fixes were impossible due to various technical limitations. One particularly puzzling aspect of the radio communications was how quickly they degraded. Early in the flight, transmissions from Flight 19 were clear and strong, but within hours, signals became weak and intermittent. suggesting the aircraft were much further away than their fuel supply should have allowed them to travel. It was as if they were flying at impossibly high speeds or somehow covering distances far greater than their aircraft's performance specifications would permit. The board investigated whether there could have been any human error in navigation planning. They examined the flight plan in detail. It was a standard route that had been flown dozens of times without incident. The navigation waypoints were clearly marked. The timing was straightforward. There was nothing about the flight plan that would predispose it to navigational difficulties. Could why didn't Powers take command? There have been a mass panic or group confusion? This theory suggested that once Taylor became lost, his uncertainty infected the other pilots, leading to collective disorientation. But this explanation failed to account for Captain Powers, who apparently recognized that they were over the Atlantic and suggested the correct course of action. Powers was an experienced pilot himself. Why didn't he take command when it became clear Taylor was confused? The Navy's command structure provided part of the answer. Taylor was the designated flight leader, and military discipline dictated that his orders be followed unless he was clearly incapacitated. Powers may have believed that Taylor, with his superior experience and combat record, knew something P didn't. By the time it became clear Taylor was fatally confused, they were too far from land for correction. The investigation also examined the loss of the rescue mariner. This aspect of the tragedy was more straightforward. PBM mariners were known to be vulnerable to fuel vapor explosions. The SS Gaines Mills had reported seeing an explosion and flames consistent with such a catastrophic failure. The board concluded that the mariner had suffered a fuel system explosion shortly after takeoff. But even this more conventional explanation had troubling aspects. Why had no debris been found? The mariner exploded over relatively shallow water not far from shore. Even if the aircraft was completely destroyed, fragments should have been recoverable. Yet, despite extensive searches, not a single piece of the mariner was ever found. After months of investigation, the board reached its official conclusions. The final report stated that Flight 19's loss was caused by Taylor becoming lost and disoriented, leading to the aircraft running out of fuel and ditching in the ocean. The report attributed Taylor's confusion to possible compass malfunction combined with increasing anxiety and exhaustion as the flight progressed. However, the board added a telling qualification. They concluded that it was not possible to determine the exact cause of the disappearance due to the complete absence of physical evidence. No wreckage had been recovered. No bodies had been found. No debris field had been located. Without physical evidence, they were essentially guessing about what had happened. The report's final conclusion was stark. The aircraft and crew are presumed lost at sea. No trace has been found. It was an admission of complete failure. The United States Navy, with all its resources and expertise, could not explain what had happened to 6 aircraft and 27 men. Taylor's mother, who was devastated by her son's death, fought fiercely against the report's conclusion that pilot error was responsible. She knew her son's capabilities and experience. She couldn't accept that he would become so completely lost under such favorable conditions. Her lobbying efforts eventually resulted in the Navy amending its report to read, "Causes or reasons unknown," rather than specifically blaming Taylor. But changing the wording didn't solve the mystery. It simply acknowledged what everyone already knew, that something impossible had happened on December 5, 1945, and nobody could explain what it was. In the decades since Flight 19's disappearance, countless theories have been proposed to explain what happened. Some are grounded in science and theories and explanations probability. Others venture into the realm of speculation and the paranormal. None have been definitively proven, and the mystery remains as baffling today as it was in 1945. The most conventional theory suggests that Taylor simply made a catastrophic navigational error. According to this explanation, Taylor became confused about his position, possibly due to compass malfunction or simple misidentification of landmarks. Believing he was over the Gulf of Mexico when he was actually over the Atlantic, he ordered his flight to head east, when they should have flown west. This wrong turn took them hundreds of miles out into the ocean, where they eventually ran out of fuel and ditched. This theory has the advantage of requiring no unusual phenomena or mysterious forces. It simply attributes the disaster to human error, compounded by equipment malfunction and poor decision-making. Experienced pilots have made fatal navigation errors before. The theory argues that Taylor, despite his experience, made a mistake and stubbornly refused to accept correction from his subordinates. But this conventional explanation struggles with several problems. First, it requires us to believe that an experienced combat veteran with 2,500 flight hours became completely disoriented in perfect visibility over familiar waters. Second, it requires multiple compass failures across multiple aircraft simultaneously. Third, it doesn't explain why no wreckage was ever found. Even if the aircraft ditched far out in the Atlantic, debris fields should have been spotted during the extensive search operations. A second theory focuses on the possibility of instrument failure. Magnetic anomalies, electronic interference, or unusual atmospheric conditions might have caused compass malfunctions across the entire formation. If all the aircraft's instruments were giving false readings, Taylor's confusion becomes more understandable. There is some scientific basis for this theory. The area where Flight 19 disappeared has been documented to have magnetic anomalies that can affect compass readings. Certain atmospheric conditions can create electronic interference. However, for this theory to work, the interference would have had to be sustained and widespread, affecting multiple aircraft for several hours. No known natural phenomenon matches this profile. A third theory suggests that Taylor may have become cognitively impaired during the flight. Hypoxia, dehydration, or some other physical condition might have affected his judgment and perception. This would explain why an otherwise competent pilot made such poor decisions and seemed unable to recognize obvious landmarks. But this theory also has problems. Other pilots in the formation would have noticed if Taylor was behaving erratically due to physical impairment. The radio transcripts show Taylor speaking clearly and rationally, even if his conclusions about his position were incorrect. He wasn't slurring his words or sounding confused in a way that suggested medical distress. He seemed certain about his position. He was just wrong about it. More exotic theories have suggested various unusual phenomena. Some researchers have proposed that Flight 19 encountered some kind of electromagnetic anomaly, or energy vortex that interfered with instruments and possibly even affected the aircraft's structure or the crew's perception. These theories often invoke quantum physics concepts or speculative electromagnetic phenomena. While these ideas make for compelling speculation, they lack scientific support. No known natural phenomenon could cause the effects reported by Flight 19. The laws of physics as we understand them don't allow for the kind of sustained, widespread instrument failure and spatial disorientation described in the radio transcripts. The disappearance of Flight 19 became inextricably linked with the concept of the Bermuda Triangle. This region of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly bounded by the Bermuda Triangle connection Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, became famous for supposedly claiming ships and aircraft under mysterious circumstances. Flight 19 is often cited as the quintessential Bermuda Triangle disappearance. However, the Bermuda Triangle concept itself is controversial. Skeptical researchers have pointed out that the number of disappearances in this region is not statistically unusual when you account for the heavy ship and aircraft traffic through the area. Many supposed Bermuda Triangle mysteries have conventional explanations that were simply overlooked or ignored in popular retellings. Yet Flight 19 remains difficult to explain away. Unlike many other cases, this disappearance occurred in perfect weather, involved multiple aircraft with experienced crews, generated extensive radio transcripts documenting the crew's confusion, and left absolutely no physical evidence despite massive search efforts. It stands apart from other maritime and aviation losses in its completeness and inexplicability. Over the decades, numerous search expeditions have claimed to find wreckage from Flight 19. These discoveries generate excitement and media attention, but so far none have been conclusively linked to the missing aircraft. Some wreckage has been identified as other crashed planes. Some has been determined to be too recent or wrong type. Some discoveries have simply disappeared upon closer investigation. In 1991, a major discovery seemed to finally solve the mystery. A salvage company located 5 Avengers sitting on the 1991 discovery, the ocean floor off the coast of Florida. The aircraft were flying in formation, just as Flight 19 would have been. Early reports indicated that this might be the missing squadron, and news outlets across the globe declared that the 79-year-old enigma had finally been solved. Yet, a thorough investigation brought disappointment. The serial numbers on the discovered planes didn't correspond to those of Flight 19. These were different Avengers, lost in an entirely separate incident. The seafloor off Florida is scattered with the wreckage of military planes from World War II training missions. Finding 5 Avengers aligned together was extraordinary. But they weren't the ones the world had been searching for. This pattern has repeated itself many times. Wrecked aircraft are uncovered. Investigators announce a possible link to Flight 19, but detailed inspection always proves otherwise. Each false discovery only deepens the mystery. If other downed aircraft can be located, why not Flight 19? Modern advancements have only intensified the riddle. Side-scan sonar can chart the ocean floor with astonishing precision. Satellite imaging can spot debris on the surface. Sophisticated models can simulate drift patterns of wreckage. Yet, despite these remarkable tools, Flight 19 remains missing. Some experts propose that the aircraft may have ditched much farther out in the Atlantic than previously assumed, in depths so extreme that recovery would be virtually impossible. The Atlantic plunges to more than 30,000 feet in certain regions. If the planes went down in such abyssal depths, they might remain forever hidden even with cutting-edge technology. But this theory demands accepting that the Avengers somehow traveled hundreds of miles beyond their expected range, distances that should have been impossible given their fuel limits and performance capabilities. The families of the lost airmen lived in uncertainty for generations. Some clung to the hope that their loved ones might have survived, perhaps rescued by a passing vessel or stranded on some isolated island. But as years turned into decades, those hopes faded. The men of Flight 19 were gone, claimed by circumstances beyond comprehension. Since December 5, 1945, our understanding of aviation, navigation, meteorology, and ocean science has evolved immensely. We've developed technologies that would have seemed like fantasy to the World War II generation. We can now track aircraft anywhere on the globe, forecast weather with stunning precision, and map the ocean's depths in incredible detail. Yet we still cannot explain what befell Flight 19. The mystery has endured through more than 70 years of technological advancement. Every attempt to uncover a definitive answer has failed. The sea keeps its secrets, and 27 men remain lost under circumstances that continue to perplex investigators. The disappearance of Flight 19 symbolizes the limits of human knowledge and mastery. This was a routine training exercise carried out in ideal conditions by skilled personnel using dependable equipment. Everything that could be prepared had been. These weren't reckless adventurers venturing into the unknown. They were disciplined servicemen performing a familiar procedure over well-charted waters. Yet despite all the preparation and expertise, catastrophe struck. Not merely a tragedy, but a complete vanishing. 27 men and 6 aircraft were erased so thoroughly that nearly 8 decades of searching have uncovered nothing. Not a single trace remains to tell us what happened in those final hours. The story of Flight 19 reminds us that even in our age of advanced technology, enigmas endure. There are still questions without answers, disappearances without explanation, and phenomena beyond understanding. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet, and much of it remains as mysterious to us as it was to ancient sailors. What happened to Lieutenant Charles Taylor and his 13 crewmen? What caused an experienced aviator to become so hopelessly disoriented? Why did multiple compasses apparently malfunction at once? Where did 6 large aircraft and 27 men go? Why was no wreckage ever recovered? Despite one of the largest naval search efforts in history, the answers may never be known. The sea has guarded Flight 19's secrets for nearly 80 years, showing no sign of surrendering them. The families of the missing airmen have long since passed away, taking with them the grief of not knowing. Yet the mystery endures, a lasting testament to the ocean's power to consume lives and erase all evidence with haunting thoroughness. Today, the disappearance of Flight 19 remains one of the most well-documented yet baffling aviation losses in history. The surviving radio transcripts offer a chilling glimpse into the crew's final hours, their mounting confusion, exhaustion, and quiet acceptance as fuel dwindled and hope slipped away. The exhaustive Navy inquiry dismissed conventional explanations but provided nothing definitive in their place. December 5, 1945, was a flawless flying day in South Florida. Clear skies, calm seas, and 14 young men embarking on a routine training mission expected to last just 2 hours. 5 hours later, they were gone, victims of circumstances that remain beyond explanation despite decades of study and speculation. Their disappearance made the Bermuda Triangle legendary, inspired countless books and documentaries, and sparked endless theories. But beneath all the sensationalism lies a simple, heartbreaking truth. 27 American servicemen vanished without a trace, and their families never learned why. The loss of Flight 19 stands as a solemn reminder that the world still holds mysteries we cannot unravel, that human knowledge and technology do not always shield us from fate, and that sometimes, despite every precaution, people simply disappear, leaving behind questions that echo across time, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, Captain Edward Powers, and the 12 other men of Flight 19 flew into history that December afternoon in 1945. They remain there still, suspended in mystery, their fate unknown, their last moments unrecorded, their resting place unseen. The ocean claimed them utterly, and it has never given them back. And it has never given them back.